Hello and welcome to On Becoming a Healer. In an episode several months ago, we described a heroic early 20th century physician, Richard Clark Cabot. But there was one story he shared in an interview late in his life in the 1930s that he didn't want known until after his death. Many years before, in the 1890s, his brother was suffering from diabetes, type 1, and it was entirely incurable. A decision was made, one Dr. Cabot appears to have initiated, discussed with his parents, and to which his brother consented, to help his brother die. When a medical professional administers a medication or a treatment with the purpose of causing a death, typically at the request of the patient, it's usually called euthanasia. It's legal in at least 8 countries, including Canada. Last year, about 8% of the deaths in Quebec were from euthanasia. If a patient requests a prescription with the known purpose to cause their own death, that's usually called assisted suicide, and it's legal in 11 U.S. states and at least 12 countries, including Switzerland. And it's a Swiss program for assistance in dying that our guest for this podcast, Erica Baccus, and her husband, John, went to end his life. Ordinarily, in such a podcast, I turn it over to my co-host, Saul, for comment before we introduce our guest, and that will happen in a moment. But this is a sensitive topic, and I want to say this. I know that there are people around us, including among our listeners, who may be in distress, who may be thinking of taking their own lives, and I want to say up front that we really wish to understand Erica and John's story. We're deeply interested in it, and it's also the case that On Becoming a Healer doesn't want to inadvertently encourage people in distress to take their own lives. If you are in distress or you know somebody who is, please reach out to the resources that are there. The U.S.-based Suicide Prevention Lifeline is at 988, also findable online under searching for 988, or resources listed at the website for the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, afsp.org. Okay, now that I've said that, let me ask my co-host and friend, Dr. Saul Weiner, why we felt this topic might fit into our podcast.
Yeah, so Stefan, as you know, you and I had been talking about doing an episode on unassisted dying. By the way, there are a number of terms for this. Assisted dying is kind of one term that is pretty short and easy to use. People say medical assistance in dying. They say voluntary assisted dying and so forth. You and I had talked about doing this. Of course, I'm aware you've been leading a national study on suicide in people suffering from chronic pain and related opioid withdrawal. And then you happened to see an article in The Atlantic with the title, Canada is Killing Itself. It's now become, since 2016, by far, in a way, the country where the most medical assistance in dying, MAID as they call it, occurs. And so a lot of stuff was kind of buzzing around in our head. And then by a wonderful coincidence, Erica Baccus reached out to us through her agent. And all of a sudden, we had this perfect opportunity to talk to somebody who's been through this process in a very personal way with her partner, her husband, John. So I think that in today's episode, it'll be wonderful to hear a personal story and then also to juxtapose that with some of the ethical issues that people raise. There was a book I read that I just want to mention that I think influenced me quite a bit. The author is, I hope I pronounce his name correctly, but it's Ole Johannes Hartling, and it's called Euthanasia and the Ethics of a Doctor's Decisions, an Argument Against Assisted Dying. And he is a Danish physician who was chair of the Danish Ethical Council. I'm hoping that we'll get to look at this from different vantage points.
Thanks a lot, Saul. And I think that sort of the background tension here is always between the storyline of the people who are thinking about doing this, and then our struggle to understand what is the role of us, the clinicians. Ms. Erica Baccus is our guest. May I call you Erica?
Please do.
Erica grew up in Chicago and ultimately developed a very successful marketing career in the booming high-tech world of Northern California, where I actually hail from, as well as a remarkable marriage to John, who she met in Northern California. And we learned of Erica when we saw a copy of her book published on September 30th of this year. Its title is A Promise Kept, Honoring His Wishes, Embracing Our Love, published by Soul Sparks Press, and it's available from all major booksellers. It is a memoir of both the love story between Erica and her husband, John, and the story of his death, which they sought together in Zurich, Switzerland in July of 2023. Welcome, Erica.
Thank you.
So I'm really happy to have you here. And, I think that for our listeners and for me as well, the first thing to understand is a little bit about who you are. Where do you hail from? What do you do?
Well, I've been retired from my own business since January 2011, 1996. I started a market research company where all my clients were high-tech clients. It was being at the right place at the right time because the internet was just starting to move into businesses, and I had a lot of high-tech experience, and I conducted qualitative research all over the world, and it was a lot of fun. And John was a manufacturing guy. He worked for biotech companies. He actually had a patent for the laparoscopic instrument to get in to do laparoscopy easily.
Wow.
John was one of these guys who had a degree in business, but he was so engineering oriented. So we were married for 41 years. I call it a magical marriage. And we were just a couple who never quit being in love.
Mm.
The story is about my husband having Alzheimer's and
Yes.
his wish to not live to the brutal end of that disease.
Right.
And my mother had early onset Alzheimer's.
Yes.
So I knew a little bit about what that was like. And I sort of figured if anybody was going to get dementia, it would be me, that I might have the gene. Here I am now 81 years old, and so far, so good. John had nothing in his family to indicate that this would happen to him. And it's just a random, unlucky thing that he was hit with Alzheimer's.
In your book, you describe, I think, the first hint of trouble in 2017. You were taking a trip, maybe in Budapest. Something happened.
We were, we had been in Budapest, but we were in Vienna at the time. John was using a paper map to find our way back from wherever we had been touring to go back to our hotel. I watched him standing there, turning this map 90 degrees at a time and thinking, what is going on here? And I asked him, I said, are you okay? What's wrong? And he said, I'm fine. I'll find it. And he got very agitated about not knowing how to read the map. And finally, I took out my iPhone and got us walking directions back to the hotel. And when we got back to the hotel, he was very irritated with me.
Yeah.
And it was also weird. It was just so different. The behavior was different. What was happening was different. And I thought, I don't know what's going on. And at the same time, I started thinking about, he didn't remember what we did yesterday. And then it was like I would tell him what we're going to do tomorrow, what the itinerary was, and then he would have to ask me again.
Yeah.
And I thought, but then when we got home, he went totally back to normal. And I just thought, you know what? I'm just going to stick my head in the sand, and I don't want to deal with this. This isn't happening.
Yeah.
This isn't happening. And he's fine.
Sure.
And then he wasn't.
Yeah. It emerges over the course of your book that there's a few years in there where you're living with a change that is slow and sometimes ignorable, and life still has wonderful things to it. And then a diagnosis is made. I think it's 2020.
Strange year.
Yeah, a very strange year. It's the middle of the pandemic, maybe. I don't know if you went to UCSF, is it?
Yeah, we're patients of UCSF. So we had an appointment with our primary care doctor. We both had an appointment together. And John, without me knowing he was going to do it, told the primary care doctor that he was concerned about his memory. And so the doctor said, okay, let's do a little test here. He aced it. And this was in 2019, December. And the doctor said, well, John, you seem fine to me, but if you're still concerned, I'm going to put a referral in for you. So the end of the year starts rolling around, and I'm noticing more and more that John is not remembering. So I asked him if it would be okay if I would make an appointment with the UCSF Aging and Memory Center.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave me permission, so I made the appointment. And January 24th, 2020, we had the appointment. And previous to the appointment, he had a brain scan, which they had access to when we arrived.
So you went through, I think, as I recall, probably a whole day evaluation with a lot of discussions, a lot of work. And at the end of all this, they just tell you straight out, this is Alzheimer's, or do they say this is a condition? What did they say?
It was an 8-hour exam with multiple doctors. And at the end, they bring us into this conference room, and his images of his brain are up in front, and we're sitting there. And the head neurologist says, John, you have early cognitive impairment consistent with Alzheimer's, which means that, okay, he's at the early stages of Alzheimer's. And we had time for questions. John asked 2 questions. If you know John, you'll understand the questions. One question was, can I still drink alcohol? Because we like to have wine at dinner, Californians.
Yeah, I love it.
And his second question was, how long before I'm a vegetable? And I was so admired how she handled the questions. She was so straightforward. The alcohol question was, alcohol is never good, but I'm not going to tell you now that you can't have the wine that you like for dinner. And number 2, she said, on average, it takes people 5 to 6 years from diagnosis before they're a vegetable. She prescribed Aricept, which is,
Yes.
and told him the most important thing you can do for yourself is exercise. I hired a trainer for him, a personal trainer. John always worked in the garden, but that's not the kind of exercise that she was referring to. And I got all the nutrition books I could find, and I fed him blueberries every day and broccoli.
At that point in the story, did he bring up the idea that he might want assistance in dying? When did he do that?
So during our marriage, because I had experienced my mother's early onset, John had said he would never want to sit in a chair and look out a window and not be a person. He would tell me over and over again, if I don't have a brain, I am not a person. I don't want to live with it. And I agreed with him. I didn't want that for me either. And I think that's one of the most important messages that I try to communicate in my book is that it's so much better to talk to your partner, your family, your loved ones about how you want your life to end early on. So when John told me that he wanted to die, it was not a surprise to me. If you wait until you're in the middle of a trauma like this, it's too difficult to handle then. We got home from this appointment, and it was a couple of days before he approached me, but he said, I don't want to live with this. He said, I do not want to do this until the end. And of course, there was no way that I knew out. And we spent one whole afternoon with a dear friend of us who had military experience, and John had been in Vietnam, so they both knew about guns. I sat in our sunroom and listened to him talk to this person about the best way to die by suicide. And he went through shooting himself. He went through hanging. He went through poisoning. He went through jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge. We live very near the Golden Gate Bridge. I mean, he considered everything. He was adamant that he did not want to live. If I can't give to people, if I can't participate in the world, and if I don't have a brain, there's no reason for me to be here.
That conversation's in 2020, and there then unfold 3 years where you're doing things you like. As I recall, you like basketball a lot, the Warriors in particular. Go Warriors. And like there's enjoyment that's going on between the two of you, even as he's losing abilities. Is that fair to say?
It's more than fair to say. I believe that John and I never changed our normal life in a way. I mean, obviously, I adapted to all the things that he needed, but we continued to travel. We went to Spain in 2021 and Italy. We were gone for 5 weeks. In 2022, we went to France for 3 weeks. Yeah. But as time went on, like I changed the way we traveled. Our last trip in 2022, I knew it was going to be our last trip. And I did all the driving. John could not help me navigate. He no longer remembered anything that we did the day before. He didn't remember what we were doing an hour ago. And it required a lot of time to rest and sleep. He took long naps in the afternoon. So I created a schedule where there was no schedule. We had a route. We took 2 weeks to drive 100 miles, and we had a wonderful time. I have my wonderful memories, and he enjoyed it. He had never been to Paris, and he was so excited about the Eiffel Tower. He got underneath it and looked at the engineering that went into that Eiffel Tower, and then we went to the very top. And so he didn't have the memory of it, but he had the experience of it, and I will always have Paris.
That's very powerful. Saul and I are both smiling ear to ear, thinking about that. And then in your book, right at the beginning, there's a copy of a letter that John wrote in 2023. It's January of 2023 to an organization in Switzerland. And before we talk about how the letter was written, we know that some kind of assisted suicide law exists in California. This might be a good point to explain why would it not be possible in California, given what was going on for you and John?
As you mentioned, there are 11 states plus D.C. in the United States that allows some form of an end-of-life option act. But every one of those states' laws says you have to have a doctor swear an oath that says that you are dying within 6 months. And you have to have mental capacity. You have to be able to make a decision on your own, not being influenced by anyone from the outside. You have to be able to drink whatever medicine that you're going to drink to end your life. And you have to understand the parameters of what you were doing. Well, that negates anybody with a neurodegenerative disease because A, doctors cannot predict when you're going to die with dementia. And the other thing is that if you were to get to be 6 months before you die, you definitely do not have mental capacity.
At that point.
Yes. So that eliminates all of those legal ways to end your life in California, Oregon, and the other 9 states do not allow for somebody with a neurodegenerative disease. So that's why we were looking at until I found Dignitas in Zurich, Switzerland. Actually, the way I found it was through another book.
Yes, we could mention it here by Amy Bloom, I think, In Love.
Yes, exactly. That book was recommended to me in May of 2022. I got the book, I read it, and when I closed the book, I read it in 2 days, I realized this is what we've been looking for. This is the gift. Because it is a story of how she took her husband to Switzerland for him to die by an accompanied suicide. And I had never heard of it before. And so she gave me the pathway to follow. It took me 3 weeks to tell John. It was really hard for me to acknowledge that while this was a gift, it was also that meant that he would die. And secondly, if I told him on a good day, I didn't want to ruin a good day for him. He had good days and bad days. And if it was a bad day, I knew he wouldn't be able to process the information at all. So finally, after about 3 weeks, I said, okay, I just have to face this. And I sat him down and said, honey, we have to talk. And I told him he couldn't read a book anymore by this point. I said, I read this book, and I explained to him what I read, and he had questions about how it worked and what would he do and how did it work. And I explained to him that it was painless and it was fast and it was with dignity and it was what he wanted. And he said, all right, let's do this.
But that's a year before. And I think people are going to be thinking, okay, so he has a neurodegenerative disease. Does he remember this conversation, this possibility? Over the months that followed, was it your sense that he did remember that this was an option? Because
he never forgot
in the beginning, right, it's not a complete loss of memory.
No.
At the beginning of your book, there's a letter written. It's called John's letter. I guess I have to ask. And you ask, how could he write so eloquently? It's dated January 30th, 2023. It begins, Dear Sir, I'm writing to you today to formally request Dignitas to prepare an accompanied suicide for me. I'm currently suffering from Alzheimer's. Did he write that?
Amy Bloom was lovely to include in her book the letters that her husband had. These are requirements from Dignitas. It took me 7 months to do all of the paperwork and the documentation to get an approval for Dignitas. One of the first things you have to do is write a formal request to die and a biographical sketch. Amy Bloom included those of her husband's in her book, so we used it as a template.
Yeah, but he was involved in the composition. That's my reading of your book. Yeah.
Yes, he wrote a lot of it, and then of course I helped.
Yeah, and you wrote, it was one of the steps in the process that had to be completed and approved. Real was a word I used over and over to myself. And surreality is the thing I wanted to follow up on because that's in January of 2023. And I think 7 months later, you were preparing for a trip to Zurich, Switzerland. As I recall, you bought sweatpants for John. Is that right?
Yes.
That seems surreal, doesn't it?
I did. I believe that I did things that were in some regards irrational. So I decided that he needed to have new sweatpants to die in.
Yeah.
That he needed something soft and cozy and comfortable. So I went to Nordstrom, and on my way in, I said to myself, you're not going to buy a Christmas present. You're not going to buy a birthday present. You're buying something for him to die in. And I was afraid somebody was going to ask me, why are you here? Which, of course, is ridiculous.
At Nordstrom, yeah.
And I finally picked out a pair. I asked the sales lady, which is the most popular, which is the most comfortable. I touched everything to make sure that this was soft and cozy and brought them home. And the really weird thing is that I was so careful about how I was folding these and putting these away. And then when it came time to leave, John was taking everything that he needed in a backpack, and I took these carefully folded, beautiful sweatpants and just stuffed them into the backpack.
You had it for Zurich.
But I want to clarify something. While I got the book in May of 2022, John and I had decided that we were not going to do anything about Switzerland until August.
Yeah.
Because we wanted to appreciate the summer plans that we had made. Our oldest grandson was graduating high school, and we had people to see, and we were going to Lake Tahoe for our summer 4th of July. And I felt like we had that amount of time that we could do that.
Yeah.
So in August, I started the process.
And it was many months of back and forth, too.
Yeah.
Crucially, it sounds to me like, from what I could read, Dignitas is prepared to receive people when they arrive in Switzerland, but they want to see a lot of advance work to be assured that they know that both what the situation is, and also when you finally got there, they had to verify that John was John, as I recall. You went to Switzerland. You didn't stay in the heart of Zurich, as I recall. You were in a little bit of an outlying suburb. Is that right?
Yeah. This is a chapter in my book that so hard for me to write. I asked for a list of hotels to stay in, and they sent me a list, and then I didn't know. And then I asked, well, which one do you recommend? And this particular hotel was one of the ones they recommended. And what I did not realize was that it was 20 minutes outside of Zurich. And so we were in the Swiss Alps were in front of us, and Lake Zurich was right there. But there were no people around. It was an isolated rural area with cows outside.
Yeah.
Bells around its neck. So that's where we stayed.
Yeah. There's a point at which a police officer came over. Can you describe that?
So I didn't really know what was going to happen when we got there. The one thing I did know was that he would be seen by a psychiatrist in Switzerland to give the final approval.
Okay.
So we knew that was going to happen. But we get to this house the day he's going to die, and we are greeted by these two ladies that work for Dignitas. They are not medical people in any way, shape, or form, but they manage the whole end-of-life process. And the first thing you do is you sit in this kitchen area at a kitchen table, and the lady explains that John is going to have to take an antiemetic, which is an anti-nausea drug, and that takes half an hour to work. And then she says, and also, I've called the police. They should be here in about 5 minutes. And I said, what? Why is the police coming? And she said, we need to make sure that John is John, and they will be asking to see his passport and his driver's license to match his face to the documents.
Yeah.
And the Swiss efficiency, 5 minutes later, there were the police. They walk into the kitchen area and they say, who am I talking to? And John says, me. And I gave him the passport. John gave him the driver's license he still had. He looks at John and he says, okay, thank you, turns around and walks out.
Wow. He then, as I recall, goes into a bedroom.
The way the house is set up, and she explained it to us, we were in this kitchen area, and then there is a big room, and she said, there's a hospital bed, there's a reclining chair, and then there was another sofa or something. And she said, you can choose where you want to be. And I said immediately, I want to be in bed with John. I want to cuddle with John. And she said, in that case, I recommend you take the hospital bed. And after he drank the antiemetic, you waited half an hour. We sat around the kitchen table, and my son was there, and he was there for the sole purpose of escorting me home. He was not going to witness the death, but he was sitting in the kitchen with us, and we were just chatting. I don't know what we talked about. It was nothing important. And after half an hour, she said, well, the drug is effective now. You can wait a while, or you can do it now. What would you like to do? And John says, well, let's go. And so my son got up and walked into another room that was behind closed doors somewhere. And John got into this hospital bed, and I got into bed with him, and he put his arms around me. Do you want me to go on?
Yeah, I think so.
She explained to him, the lady was sitting on his side of the bed in a chair, and she said, the drink that you're going to drink is very bitter, and I have Swiss chocolates for you here to take away the taste if you'd like. And by the way, what he was drinking was sodium pentobarbital, 5 times the lethal dose. John has his arm around me, and I'm, cuddled up with him. And, he took a sip and he said, "Oh my God, this is the worst tasting thing I've ever had in my life. Is this the last thing I'm going to drink before I die?" And she said, "I told you I have chocolates here."
The chocolate.
And he reached over into her hands and he took a handful of those chocolates and stuffed them into his mouth. And then he drank the whole drink. And he laid down and we were spooned. And within 3 minutes, I felt his arm drop and I turned my body around to look at him and he was gone. I sat up and felt his heart. And I didn't feel anything. And I asked the lady, I said, do you have a stethoscope here? No stethoscope. And I said, well, I need to prove that he's dead. And she said, he had 5 times the lethal dose. He's dead. I said, I don't care. I need to prove it. And she said, I have a pen light. And I said, okay. I come from a medical family, so I knew what a pen light was.
There were lots of doctors in your family. Yes.
So we looked at his beautiful blue eyes that didn't move. And I felt his pulse that didn't beat. And again, I touched his heart. And I started to see purple splotches come in his skin so fast. I was stunned by how fast it happened. And then after a while, my son walked into the room. And he looked at John from the doorway and said, "That's not John."
Your son was a prior mate. And so this was not John's son.
Right.
Yeah.
John was his stepfather.
Yeah.
John and I got married when my son was 14. And they were best friends.
Yeah.
And I started to believe he was actually gone, dead.
And you headed home?
I did not head home. I went to Chicago with my son.
Yes, that's right.
I
because you have lots of family there.
Yeah, my grandsons were there, and I just didn't want to go home alone. And so they invited me to stay there. I stayed there 2 weeks. I have a sister in Wisconsin, an hour and a half from their home. She flew back to California with me and stayed a week with me in California.
Can you share for a moment? To my reading of your book, it describes mixed feelings about all of this. It's not all one clean, beautiful story. Amidst the mixed feelings, did you wind up feeling like this was somehow truly the right decision?
Absolutely. There were a lot of mixed feelings, and I can talk to you about that in a minute. But I want to say it is now 2 years later, 2 years and 4 months. And I am so grateful that Dignitas exists. And I am so grateful that I found Dignitas, because this was a gift to John. It would be such torture for him to be alive today, suffering through the brutal end of Alzheimer's. I would not want that for him. I would not want to watch him suffer like that. And even more than my watching him suffer, I knew how much he did not want that. And I loved him. I wanted him to have what he wanted. I just so believe that he had the right to die, choose his own end. He asked me over and over and over again in those years, "Erica, is this okay with you? Erica, is this okay with you?" And every time he asked me, I said, "John, this is your life. You get to choose what you want to do with your life. It is not my choice. I love you and I will do what you want me to do, but I cannot tell you what to do." And I knew that if I had said, "Please don't," he wouldn't have. And then I would have had to live with forcing this beautiful man to live in a way that he did not want to live. So my ethics are that we have a right to choose, and he had a right to choose his own life. Now, the other side of that was when I came back, I was overwhelmingly grief-stricken, and some have called it a complicated grief. And my grief started with, well, maybe I should have objected. Maybe he died because he thought I wanted him to die. Maybe he decided that he was a burden to me and I wanted him to go. Maybe I brainwashed him. I had to choose the date because he was not capable of choosing the date. And he told me, "Erica, you're going to have to be the one to choose the date." And so then I thought, well, maybe I should have pushed it out further. Maybe it was too soon. I started questioning every decision that we made along the way. And I felt so guilty. The psychiatrist who gave John his last mental capacity exam in the United States, a dearly beloved man, I said to him during that exam, "I know that I'm going to need help when this is over.
Sure.
Could you please take me on as a patient?" And he said he would. And he has a psychiatric practice that is at least 50% end of life. I still talk to him once a week, and he helped me through so much of it. And for example, when John was in bed getting ready to drink that drink, what I left out was he said, should I do it now? He was asking me, should I do it now? And I shrugged my shoulders.
Yeah.
And afterwards, I thought, who does that? I could have hugged him. I could have said, I love you. I could have said, wait a minute. I could have done a million different things. And I shrugged my shoulders. And then he drank it. And the thing that the psychiatrist told me, because I've gone over this a million times, the thing that he said to me was, Erica, it wasn't your choice. John was in control. And all of a sudden, I felt this huge relief because I had been in control of so much.
Right. That was your job to arrange things. And yet here he was in control.
He was in control. He had that glass in his hand. He knew what he was doing. I still wish I had given him another hug.
Yeah.
But I suppose I was in some sort of other place. I don't know. When I started writing the book, I wasn't intending to write a book. I was just writing. And I had to go through some of the journals. I had kept notes of John's condition throughout the years that he was ill. And I went back and read things like, Erica, shoot me now. Just shoot me now. Erica, I want to die. So as I started writing, I started to ground myself in reality again. And so the book, not only do I hope it helps other people, but the writing process helped me heal.
What I have been struggling with is when I listen to this as Stefan, the human being, I am just sort of swept away with a certain feeling of emotional respect, reverence almost for you and for John. And then there's this other part of me that's the doctor part, which is thinking, what does it mean for doctors, medical doctors in the United States or Canada to become the provisioners, as it's called in Canada, of this same service? And then there's a real lurch of discomfort. And I wonder, just from your point of view, you went to an organization specialized in this in Switzerland. You've dealt with the American medical profession. If Aetna and Blue Cross Blue Shield and Cigna got together and said, we want to make sure this is available, would that be something you want? Would you trust that we would do it right?
My answer to that is I have such respect for Dignitas because they had so many rules and so many provisions that we had to follow. And they were so disciplined and so strict. And I don't understand why there were no medical professionals in that house, but I assume it's got something to do with legalities.
Okay. Yeah.
So if the United States were as disciplined and strict as Dignitas, then yes, because it is a hardship to fly halfway around the world to go to die. Being away from your family, being away from friends. It was a hardship on John. It was a hardship on me. The expense of it, it's a luxury to do what we did. Most people can't afford to do what we did. There's a membership fee that you have to pay to Dignitas. There's the airplane flight. There's a hotel. This isn't something that anybody and everybody can do. And the thing is, it's a whole ethical, moral, legal question, I suppose, that we're dealing with here. I sometimes think about having the right to die similar to the abortion issue, which is my body, my choice.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm a believer in my body, my choice.
What I have struggled with is that at every turn in my life where I've thought about physicians taking on this role, I have felt like I can't or we can't. I'll say this. As a human being, if you put me in a certain situation, I could imagine that I could see the rationale for me to assist someone's death. So I'm in a World War I battlefield. This is an example given to me by someone else. The soldier next to me is injured by shrapnel. They're in agony. I'm a soldier too. And they say that, there's no medical care. There's no morphine. There's no nothing. And they say, please help me end this now. And as a human being, I could see myself saying, okay, maybe that's what I'm going to do. It's terrible, but I have to do it. But if you turn to me and say, Stefan, you're a doctor, and the medical profession is charged with protecting, upholding, and advocating for people who are suffering, including people who may be very disabled and who often don't have adequate access to what they need when they're disabled. But by the way, on the table, in case you can't succeed at that other stuff, you can also offer this. You could also offer the possibility that they could work with you to end their life as an alternative Should that be on the table? And every time I hit that, I think I can't put that on my table as a doctor.
Well, I never saw a doctor in Switzerland except for a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
Whatever doctors there were in this process were all behind the scenes. There was a doctor I know who wrote a prescription for the medicine. That was it.
Yeah.
But there were no medical professionals other than the psychiatrist who came anywhere near this whole process visibly to us.
So, Saul, we're tracking a profound story of honoring John's wishes, as Erica did, using a very carefully run organization in another country. And we're simultaneously asking, is this something that we can take on, that any society should generally take on, and can we take it on as a medical profession?
I have to preface by saying that Erica has been through an experience that I haven't been through. And so I'm speaking in a more abstract philosophical way, whereas Erica has had a deeply personal experience. The other thing I'll say is that there are a number of arguments against euthanasia, and one of the most commonly applied arguments does not apply to Erica's situation, and that is any type of coercion. In the case of John, there is no question in my mind that this man got his wishes. This is what he wanted. It had nothing to do with anybody pushing him in any direction. But when you look at countries and places that have done this on a large scale, and Canada has become a very cautionary tale, it has become unquestionably a concern. If, for example, in the Atlantic article and in other articles I've read, patients have said that they decided to end their life because they didn't want to be a burden, or they couldn't afford the care that they would need to live in a reasonable way. There also are definitely concerns that when it becomes almost institutionalized in a society, patients are coming in and it's basically being presented to them as, quote, treatment option.
Yeah.
And this clearly has been happening in Canada. It's been happening in some other countries too, the Netherlands. And so when it's being done on that scale, there are just so many cautionary tales of individuals feeling like, wow, this is now something people may be wondering if I should be considering for myself because I will become a burden. And I've been told that this is a, quote, option.
I need to comment about that burden thing because it's really important. If you mention that you don't want to be a burden in your letter that you write or in your talking to them, Dignitas will send you home.
Yeah, but in a lot of these cases, people did not say that they felt that they were a burden.
Okay.
It's just that in some level, they feel like they may be a burden. You may not articulate it or say it.
Do you know anyone who wants to be a burden? And is it possible to have a disease like Alzheimer's and not be a burden?
Not me.
So I think that whole issue about being a burden makes no sense to me. None of us wants to be a burden, and you can't avoid it if you live through all of that.
Well, so here's the counter argument. This gets a little abstract, but I hope you'll bear with me here. It does require a different way of looking at human life, but there's a view that humanity is inherently sacred, and it's, by the way, it's not a religious view, and that there are people, for example, in palliative care who have a deep commitment to caring for people who are profoundly disabled and loving them to the very last moment and making them comfortable and doing everything possible for them. And it becomes incredibly difficult for us to say at what point does that person become a sufficient, quote, burden that a physician or any organization will be willing to go along with the wish of the patient to end their life. Because one of the things about this is in order for a euthanasia to occur, there has to be not just somebody who wants to die that way, but there has to be somebody who's willing to do it. And so we have to ask ourselves, at what point does that person say, okay, I'm willing to do this? And in Canada, there are physicians who are doing several of these a week and who have done 500, 600, 700 of these at this point.
They inject the patient. They actually do.
And they do it. Active. In Canada, it's overwhelmingly done not by the patient, but by the doctor. Canada last year had 15,000 of these. And so a lot of these physicians are just literally doing several a week.
These aren't dementia patients.
They're all over the map. They may be dementia. They may be, in fact, in 2027, they're going to start doing it for mental illness. And so the range is vast of people who choose to die this way. And in fact, that's why it's been growing at a very rapid level. It's now more people die by euthanasia in Canada now than by diabetes and Alzheimer's combined. And Parliament has agreed in principle to start including minors. And minors are now eligible for euthanasia in several countries, including the Netherlands.
And Canada is only for Canadian citizens, right? It's not, you can't travel there and do it. I think that's all.
I believe that's right.
Why does Canada matter?
Well, I think Canada is this cautionary tale because it's exploded there. It's grounded in this idea that it should be a right because, and by the way, citizens overwhelmingly support it. They believe this is an option they want to have, and that this is something that should be an issue of personal autonomy.
That's the key word, autonomy.
It is. Can I ask a philosophical question?
Yes.
Yeah.
As physicians, you sign an oath to do no harm, right?
Yeah.
So that's your major barrier here, is that you don't want to do any harm. On the other side of the coin is you're saying that it's better for someone to live through torture, basically, and not only just for himself or herself, but for accompanying friends and family. What makes physicians believe outside of this do no harm that you have the right to tell me that I have to suffer?
It's a great question. So first of all, in the admonitions of the Hippocratic Oath, it actually says, "Nor shall any man's entreaty prevail upon me to administer poison to anyone, neither will I counsel any man to do so." So I just want to state by saying the Hippocratic Oath specifically forbids physician involvement in euthanasia. So that doesn't mean we have to go with Hippocratic Oath.
We don't. We got rid of other provisions.
We got provisions. So I just want to start with that. It's a foundation.
I like it.
But then you asked this question about suffering. So there's a concept that distinguishes between passive euthanasia and active euthanasia. Passive euthanasia is the withholding of, for example, nutrition, antibiotics, and so forth, when a person has a condition and they say, I wouldn't want anything done to prolong my life. And there's a clear consensus among ethicists that people absolutely have a right to request not to have things done to them, not to be given antibiotics, not nutrition. No debate about that, really, among, I think, medical ethicists. They make a very clear distinction, though, between the right to refuse and the right to demand a specific service. In this case, it's somebody will kill you. And I think that's a very important line that distinguishes passive from active euthanasia from the standpoint of the person who is doing it, which in this case would be a physician. In Canada, would be a physician. And so I think that's the first thing. Now, the second thing is your question is about, quote, doing no harm. What does it mean to do no harm? I think that those who are involved in palliative care, for instance, feel passionately that they are there to love and support and minimize suffering for people at the end of life. Interestingly, Sir William Osler, who is a renowned physician from an earlier era, wrote about this and said that actually only about 90% of people die peacefully without any suffering. And I don't know if that statistic is exactly right. So fortunately, most of us will die without a lot of suffering, but there is a small portion of us who will need some sort of relief of that suffering. And the suffering, by the way, associated with euthanasia is usually not physical suffering. Physical suffering actually is quite treatable, with narcotics and other methods. But there are other kinds of suffering that can be really
like
hard.
John had.
Right. Or John avoided, I guess we would say, or he was approaching.
Yeah.
Life is uncertain. It's a normal there's a trajectory each of us takes from birth to death. And there's a certain reverence that physicians have or should have for life. And everybody's path is unknown. We don't know what path we're going to go down. We don't know where we're headed. We don't know whether we're going to be in that 90% or whether we're going to get ALS or Alzheimer's or cancer and so forth. And there's a sense, an ethos among physicians that the dignity is in the living and that our job is to be there to comfort and support people from birth to death through that process, and that relieving suffering by ending life is distinctly different, and that when you introduce that as an option or as one of the things that a physician can do, you potentially change the physician-patient relationship. And you also create a set of options for patients once this is, quote, on the table that changes the calculus for them. And as they start to think about, as you said, I'm a burden. And therefore, this is something that I should consider doing, so I'm not a burden to others. And when physicians take that off the table and say, no, I don't do that. I don't do euthanasia. I will not kill you. Then the issue of being a burden is no longer a burden for that patient. It's entirely about the physician being present for them through that process of life until a natural death, and to assure that they have comfort. That's the argument, the philosophical argument for the physician not being involved in euthanasia. One of the ethicists who wrote about this was talking about how, well, maybe this should be, philosopher-induced euthanasia. So maybe we should actually say, no, physicians don't do this, but, maybe this should be done by somebody else who philosophically thinks that, it doesn't require a lot of expertise. So maybe this isn't something physicians should be doing. So I thought that was sort of an interesting twist on this.
Well, that was sort of my point about Dignitas is there were no doctors around. Somewhere in the background, somebody wrote a prescription and got it to the building we were in. And
yeah. So I think you could make the argument, and I could make the argument myself, speaking personally, that I as a doctor do not kill people ever. I will withhold care from them at their request. Absolutely. But I will not kill them ever. And that is something that is just fundamental to my role as a healer.
But
now,
you could have another profession do it.
Perhaps. But then I think you've relieved some of the ethical arguments against it, which is the role of a physician.
But I'll switch sides now.
Yeah.
If you have some other profession do it, like a lawyer or a philosopher or whoever, then we've removed the guardrails in some ways. And I would say that this is something that shouldn't, from the way you're describing Canada, is frightening to me, because it should be taken very, very cautiously and seriously in the manner in which it is done.
Yeah. Well, I think the problem in Canada is that there is a concern the guardrails have come off, and it is only being done by physicians or people comparable to physicians, advanced practice nurses. And so clearly they're not doing a good job of keeping guardrails on, if you want to look at it from that standpoint. So I think that as we start to look at these different ethical components to it, one issue is, should healthcare professionals be the ones doing it? And if the argument is yes, because they protect the guardrails, clearly that's not adequate to the guardrails because of what we're seeing happen in Canada. I think Dr. Hartling in his book said that when he actually did talk to some philosophers who were strong advocates for euthanasia, he said, well, how would you feel if we just had you do it? And they were horrified. They're like, no, we're not going to do it.
They don't want to do it.
And he talked about another physician who was practicing in a place where a family member had said, look, my loved one really wants this. Will you do it? And the physician said no, and the person kept asking, and then they said, I'll tell you what, I will leave the room, and there's a pillow over there, and you can use that pillow and put it over their face and hold it for a couple of minutes, and that'll do it, and I won't tell anyone. And the family member was like, no, I'm not going to do that. That's horrifying.
No, it's impossible.
But what Dr. Hartling tells that story for is he basically says, this is not something anyone wants to do, and so that should give us pause as we reflect on this really challenging dimension of addressing suffering through this particular approach.
I wrote in my story that I kept waiting for approvals that I didn't want to get.
You had this ambivalence. You couldn't. How could you not? How could you be one purpose at those moments?
Now, one question I have for you, Erica, is can you imagine a situation where John thought about his life differently and said, look, part of being human is that we don't know what deck of cards we're going to get. And the deck of cards that God is not a great deck of cards. I'm going to have this progressive dementia, and I'm going to become what he calls a vegetable. But I'm going to actually take away that word because the word has negative connotations. I'm simply going to lose my faculties. I'm going to become increasingly dependent. I'm going to become increasingly unaware of who's around me, increasingly disoriented, increasingly in some inner world that I can't currently comprehend. I won't know who my wife is. I won't know who my children are. And at some point, I'll die from it. And during that time, I will be loved. I will be cared for. I will be a burden. And that's just the way it is. And that's part of the human experience. And so, and then we're going to create a society in which we do a much, much better job of loving and caring for people, no matter what deck of cards they get. And if they're poor, by the way, we're going to create a society where we're going to invest the resources such that that person gets the care and support and love they need until the end, no matter what that journey is, whether it's one where we have to control pain, or it's one where we're dealing with dementia, whatever it is, we're going to create a society where we care for people from birth to grave if they get a bad deck of cards. And by the way, some people are profoundly disabled from birth on, right?
Mm-hmm.
They used to lock them up in institutions.
Mm-hmm.
So the philosophy that I'm kind of trying to introduce here is one where we think that all human life has dignity. You're never a vegetable. And there's no loss of dignity just because you are pooping in your pants and you don't know who you are and so forth. That the dignity is inherent. And people who work in palliative care and the ones who are very committed to it cherish their patients through that process because they honor that the inherent dignity of life. And I'd love to get your thoughts about, and that's a different view than the one John had.
So we were faced with that before I found Dignitas. And I told John, honey, I will take care of you. I will do everything I can to take care of you. And he said, well, there'll be a time where you won't be able to. And I said, I'll hire help. I'll get 24 round-the-clock help in the house. I don't care. I'll use our money. I don't care. And then I thought about, oh, my God, what would happen if I died first? Which would have been very possible. I was 2 years older than John. I've had health issues. And then who's going to love him and take care of him? Sure, we've got kids and we have grandkids and we've got sisters and brothers-in-law and all that kind of stuff. You can't do that to your family, or I don't believe you can. And so then it would have been an institution. The way our institutions are today, that's not someplace that I would want to put somebody I loved. And then what you're saying is, when you're brain dead, you're dead, right?
When you're brain dead, you're dead, yes.
When you're brain dead, you're dead. Mm-hmm. So at the extreme time of Alzheimer's, I don't know what you call your brain at that point, but it's not working very well. Yep. So, my point being is this is a disease of the brain. Mm-hmm. This isn't cancer or heart disease or anything else. This is your brain. And if you can't use your brain, there's not much you can be. I mean, are you a life at that point? John's belief was he wasn't a life.
Well, one of the challenges that you faced, which was profound, was this deciding on the date. And the reason this was so important, and I just want to make sure this is clear to people, is because if you waited too long and he got past that point where he could not demonstrate competence at the time of death, they wouldn't do the procedure.
He had to show that he understood what he was doing and that it was his choice, not influenced by anybody else.
So one of the things that Canada will do is let somebody in advance say that if I get to such and such, I want to be euthanized. And in so doing, we remove this brutal situation of having to pick a date. In other words, the problem you had, Eric, is that if you had waited too long, you could have gotten to a point where Dignitas would no longer be willing to do the procedure because he wouldn't be able to consent at the time. And so what Canada has said is, well, okay, so we will create a situation where the person is, when their faculties are fully intact, they've said, when I get to a certain point, that's when I want the euthanasia.
Here's a problem with that. John would put on a blue shirt to go out to dinner. 10 minutes later, he took it off and had a red shirt on. He changed his mind.
Well,
his decisional state could change.
Erica, what happened in the case, and this has happened in one of the cases they describe in the literature in Atlantic, is they euthanized the person against their resistance because they said that this person had indicated very clearly that they wanted to be euthanized. And what happened is a judge made a determination that if the physician felt that the person's attempt to resist the euthanasia was not because they understood what was being done to them, but because they were just agitated as a result of their advanced dementia, they should proceed. So there were these extremely uncomfortable situations where people were basically being held down and euthanized against resistance, based on a prior statement by them that that's what they would want.
Now, that's as much as it sounds ideal. To me, it sounds very frightening, very scary. So I obviously have talked about this with friends and family and people. And the thing that I tell people, because people will say, oh, yeah, I'd do that. That sounds like a good option for me. And I would say to people, it's so easy to say this is what you were going to do. It's another thing to do it.
Yep.
And it was very difficult for me. As I was talking about the grief that I had, my first thought when I came home was I murdered my husband. And as you know, I loved him dearly.
Yes, I do.
But I was plagued with that,
Each time I confront this topic, I'm defeated by it.
Have you considered what you would do for yourself?
At present, the way I think is I would be very comfortable ceasing any number of treatments, including nutritional support or fluids, and that would be as far as I would go. And that I understand I may well impose on or cause real challenges for the people in my life in some way. In my mind, I've committed them. I hope they know that. If not, they're finding out by listening to this podcast. But I assume the same commitment for them.
It's a really valid question to ask us. I think that for me, the question of what I would want for myself if I developed Alzheimer's is one set of questions. But there's another set of questions, which is the more philosophical issue of what do I think is appropriate for physicians to do, as thinking it from an ethical perspective. And secondly, how should a society honor its human life? And if we go back, Erica, to the scenario where you were kind of thinking about, wow, what happens if I die before he goes, and so forth. Let's suppose there had been no dignitas. Let's suppose there were really no pathways whatsoever, and you really didn't have any options but to just let the disease take its course. And let's suppose that there were nursing homes that you trusted, that you felt loved the people who live there, care for them, honor them, and that was deeply held ethos, and that you had to go down that journey with John. And hopefully you wouldn't have predeceased him. But if you did predecease him, you would know that your kids would have the option of putting him into a nursing home. Obviously, they could see him, they could be with him. All those who survived you would be available, but that he would get excellent care. He would be supported and so forth. That would just be the default path, right, in an ideal situation. Now imagine that we actually had a society that did that for everyone. Even people who are poor, even people who don't have the fortunate resources that you have, that we have, and that was the path. That's the alternative vision, where there is no option of euthanasia, but there's the honoring of every person in that society and the infrastructure for that. And by the way, it's not entirely a utopia. There are definitely palliative care programs that will care for people for years with great love and support. And there are people who are deeply committed to that. But that's the alternate vision.
Well, it's a nice vision. It's lovely. And B, it is not what is currently available. And C, John's moral compass was absolutely, I do not want to take up space on this planet if I cannot contribute.
This was John's view.
This was John's view. And it would have been a crime to not honor his belief system. It was who he was as a person. I knew him for 43 years, and it was so consistent to his value system.
Here's the counter to that. I actually accept that as true. But imagine if there is no way in which you can create a society that allows this at scale without harming lots of people. Not John, but what we're finding with Canada is the slippery slope. And so the question is it possible to create a society where euthanasia is one of the options for dying that doesn't go down that slippery slope, where people of lesser means, of lesser resources and so forth are not, or disability. And so that's the challenge. And so what I can imagine is having a conversation with John where I could say to him, look, this is absolutely the right thing for you. No question. But if we create a society where this is institutionalized, many others will be adversely affected. That's the challenge. Is it possible for society to do this right?
How is the Swiss society surviving?
Yeah. So the data on Switzerland is looking here in 2023. There were 1,729 people who died by euthanasia.
Essentially assisted dying rather than euthanasia.
Yeah, and in those cases, it was all situations where they had to self-administer the medication, as opposed to in Canada, where it's generally done by a physician.
And those are not all Swiss people.
Exactly.
Oh.
They're not all Swiss people.
So it's a small number.
Right. And so the question is, what proportion of people in Switzerland have this as an option for them, based on the fact that it looks like the number of people who go down this path is quite small.
So I believe that people feel a sense of relief once that they know that they have an option.
Yes.
And many people do not take advantage of their right to die. But just knowing that they can have that choice gives them a sense of freedom and a sense of relief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're proposing is that there may be a way to do this that works ethically.
Yes.
And I think what you've done for us is tell a story, a powerful story of someone you loved more than anyone else and for whom this was deeply the right thing. And then we have that story, and then we have this big picture. And the story I want to leave people with, just as a physician, is that for physicians, life is always sacred, that our focus is on comforting people, not ever killing them, and that's our sacred trust in our relationship with patients. So that's one thing I want to propose. And that as far as whether this is the right thing for a society or not, I'm just going to say that's above my pay grade. I'm going to say that, like, I ain't going to go there. But as a doctor, as a physician, I'm going to make the case from my standpoint that I'm a healer, and that I will be there for you. And I also want to take the case, and we've done this in many other episodes, that we fail at that all the time.
Yeah,
not just around euthanasia. That the physicians fail constantly to be there for their patients in so many ways. We fail every day as a profession. That's a huge issue.
As a layperson who relies on several physicians every year, I want to know that my physicians do believe that they will not harm me. I do want to have trust in my doctors to know that they will do the best that they can for me and keep me going, keep me
and
healthy.
That they will be with you no matter what happens, and that they will be with you in the most complete sense to comfort you and to protect you from suffering in any way they can. And that's the sacred responsibility of a physician.
I appreciate both of you speaking here. I told you how defeated I feel by this issue. I do think there's immense value in learning stories of particular people while we look at the philosophy, while we look at the politics. The story that Erica took the time to write gave us an anchor that is a gift. And I want to thank you for writing it down. The book, just for people to remember, is A Promise Kept: Honoring His Wishes, Embracing Our Love, published by Soul Sparks Press, written by Erica Baccus. And I'm thankful to you for being with us and for entertaining this difficult discussion, and to my co-host, Saul Wiener. Thanks.
Yeah, Erica, I so appreciated this because you're so willing to be vulnerable, which is essential to telling a story this powerful and this important. And you're also willing to have a conversation that challenges some of the premises. And I so appreciate that. And that's so helpful to all of our listeners. So thank you for that.
Well, I would like to thank you both for having this discussion with me. It was a very, very positive discussion in my mind.
Thanks, Erica.
We hope you've enjoyed this latest episode of On Becoming a Healer. If you have and you haven't already subscribed, please consider doing so now. Also, please rate us on the Apple Podcast app, as it will help others find us. And if you have a few moments, leave a review. In addition, if you'd like to make a comment about this episode, we'd love to hear from you. There are a couple ways to do that. If you're using the Apple Podcast app, then just open the episode website link and enter your comment there. Or you can directly go to the website contextualizingcare.org, select the podcast tab, and then scroll down and click on the episode. There you'll find the same comment box. Finally, you can always reach us at onbecomingahealer@gmail.com.